It impacts everyone, from congested interstates
The highway system's kind of on the breaking point all the time.
to potholed country roads.
Moses Lake doesn't have our congestion problems. They have different kinds of problems.
Transportation is one of the most challenging issues facing our state and our country.
People react by what they're dealing with, and when we're sitting in traffic in Tacoma for the last many years and all the different things that seems to be, and that is their connection to transportation.
It used to be the feds picked up the tab with the federal gas tax revenue.
They have basically left the playfield on funding.
Now it mostly falls to states to fund roads, bridges, and transit. How do we pay to keep up the infrastructure we have and build a transportation system for the future?
In the next 10 years, I've been able to identify that somewhere between 20 and 25 billion that we need that we don't have.
While states grapple with less federal funding across the country in the nation's capital,
What we need to do at the federal level is, I think, increase the gas tax and index the federal portion of it so we don't run into this problem again.
calls from lawmakers and organizations to increase the nation's gas tax for the first time since 1993, before it's too late.
The Highway Trust Fund is going to become insolvent by 2021, is what data suggests.
But would raising the federal fuel tax be enough? The question has many searching for alternative funding and financing options.
There could be a federal share, there can be a state and local share, so it doesn't have to be 100% federal funding.
And beyond building better roads and bridges, the newly proposed legislation that pushes for safer streets for all.
One of the biggest challenges we have right now is really changing the infrastructure that prioritizes the high-speed movement of vehicles.
From the capital of Washington State
to the capital of the United States, this is Washington to Washington.
Hello and welcome to Washington to Washington. I'm Jennifer Huntley in Washington State in front of one of the 275 Department of Transportation road construction projects currently underway in this state.
And I'm Tammy Thuringer in Washington, D.C., where a $287 billion transportation package is making its way through Congress. In both Washingtons and across the country, transportation impacts almost everyone daily.
And that's why we're devoting the next 2 episodes of Washington to this issue. In this first episode, we'll explore funding and infrastructure. How much money goes to states from the federal government for transportation? And where are the shortfalls? We start out here in Washington State. It's been 4 years since the last big transportation package passed in 2015. The 16-year, $16 billion funding bill included a 12 cents per gallon increase in the gas tax. The money was dedicated to new projects, maintenance and preservation, as well as transit and alternative modes of transportation. We spoke with lawmakers on the front lines of transportation funding and policy in Washington. They told us, given the needs in our state and the lack of federal support, another funding package may be on the horizon, even as frustration mounts over what seems like perpetual construction on our roads.
People have had it up to here with how long the construction is going on and what will be next and when is it going to end.
Transportation woes are felt by everyone. State Representatives Jake Fye and Andrew Barkis know all about it. They experience their own travel headaches and hear from people back in their districts, tired from long commutes caused by heavy traffic and construction projects, even in more rural areas.
You don't have to drive too far. Just try to drive into Yelm on any given evening, and you'll see that backup starting as people are heading home.
These lawmakers serve on the legislature's Joint Transportation Committee. Formed in 2005, it researches transportation issues to help with policy and decision making, decisions made more complicated by the state's population growth. In 2010, more than 6.7 million people lived in Washington. By 2015, Washington's population topped 7.1 million. In June of this year, the number jumped to more than 7.5 million, with the majority of those people moving from other states. And more people means more congestion, not just in urban areas, but throughout the state.
The biggest impact is growth that we're seeing spreading into the rural areas. And an infrastructure that supported, 2-lane highways and 2-lane rural roads now being taxed with moving a lot more people. And so that, compounded with changes in our economy driving more people that aren't able to work where they live, and so they're having to commute.
For most, that means considerable time spent in their cars.
A lot of our folks go north for jobs, and so that takes up a lot of time. There's not light rail to Tacoma yet, so people still have limited choices, and so people, I think, are also struggling with the amount of time it takes them to get anywhere, and the fact that they can't count on what time frame it's going to be for them to arrive at their destination.
The demand for more transportation choices means more money at a time when federal transportation funding to states is going down. Back in 2013, Washington's two-year transportation budget included $1.8 billion in federal funds. That number dropped to $1.2 billion in 2015. In 2017, a slight increase, with $1.3 billion coming from the federal government. But in 2019, a drop in federal funds, with Washington State projecting roughly $860 million from the feds over the next 2 years, a more than 50% decrease from 2013 levels. This means growing pressure on states to come up with new ways to fund more projects while maintaining existing roads and bridges battered after years of heavy use.
People don't get excited about maintaining it, right? They expect, for some reason, they expect that that's just going to happen magically, and it doesn't happen magically.
Along with maintenance, part of the state's transportation obligations include hundreds of millions of dollars to fix under-roadway pipes that block migrating fish and severely impact salmon recovery. The state is under a court order to fix these culverts by 2030. The legislature designated $100 million towards fixing the culverts this year, a third of what Governor Jay Inslee had requested. In a surprise move, the governor then moved an additional $175 million from other transportation projects into culvert repair. But even that is far less than what many believe is needed to comply with the court. And both Fye and Barkis acknowledge the state is in a transportation funding crisis. I think everyone agrees that we can't rely on the federal trust fund or the gas tax for road maintenance, especially as we move towards electric cars. What's the future then for funding? We're talking about this need to maintain our roads. So is this going to fall squarely on the state?
I think any project of any significance is going to have tolling.
And we hear a lot of what's called deferred maintenance. And in my industry, in the real estate industry, we don't like deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance happens though, but it catches up to you. And at some point in time that will catch up to you, and you have to pay the price because both the impact of deferring it for a long period of time costs more to fix it, plus also the costs are higher.
Fye and Barkis agree that a funding solution will likely come from a number of different sources. Tolling might pay for new projects. A road usage charge is being studied for others. However, there is concern over privacy issues and equity for Eastern Washington drivers who typically drive more miles. Seattle is looking at congestion pricing, a practice New York City will adopt this fall, charging a fee to come into the city during rush hour. As for their message to the other Washington,
they have basically left the playfield on funding.
With a strong federal partner, the state can be a strong partner within the counties and cities. So, and that has to work together in order to maintain, not only maintain a system, but also to grow the system as it moves forward.
So a lot to consider here in Washington State as lawmakers are having to debate the future of funding as well as the future of transportation, such as expanded light rail and self-driving cars, which we will explore in our next episode of Washington to Washington. But on the funding front, clearly Washington lawmakers feel that the federal government should be shouldering more of the costs. Tammy, what are you hearing in D.C.?
Jennifer, here in Washington, D.C., Congress is working on federal transportation legislation that would continue to help fund state projects.
Mr. Chairman, America's transportation infrastructure, both urban and rural, needs significant repair, replacement, and expansion.
In July, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee voted unanimously to advance a transportation bill that would fund the repair and maintenance of roads and bridges across the country. The America's Transportation Infrastructure Act is a 5-year reauthorization of the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or FAST Act, that is set to expire next fall. The ATIA authorizes $287 billion in funding from the Highway Trust Fund starting in 2021. More than 90% of the funds, about $259 billion, would go directly to states. Max Cuney, a fourth-generation infrastructure contractor from Spokane, recently testified before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee.
Reports provided by the Federal Highway Administration, based on state DOT data, identify a litany of troublesome facts, including failing and underperforming pavements, bridges that are structurally deficient or don't meet modern specifications, congestion caused by insufficient capacity in key locations, inadequate intermodal connections, and safety hazards.
But passing the reauthorization is just part of the funding puzzle.
In the past, what Congress has done is use smoke and mirrors, and we've run out of smoke and mirrors. So we've actually have exhausted our supply, and now we need to figure out how we're actually going to fund the Highway Trust Fund.
The federal fuel tax is the main revenue source for the Highway Trust Fund, where funds for the ATIA would come from, and the tax hasn't been increased since 1993.
The driver is the gas tax. And I think right now the only mechanism that we're really left with to fund the Highway Trust Fund is a gas tax increase. That's what I propose.
The last time the fuel tax was raised, the price at the pump averaged $1.13 a gallon. And raising the tax from where it's been stuck for more than 25 years may not be enough.
What we need to do at the federal level is, I think, increase the gas tax and index the federal portion of it so we don't run into this problem again. The buying power of the 1993 gas tax increase now has dropped 40%. So today's 2019 federal gas tax is actually 40%, has 40% less purchasing power than 1993 when they increased it. So even if you increase it by 15 cents, just pick 15 cents, you actually only get a 2 or 3 cent real increase because it's been eroded so much over the last several decades.
Failure to increase the tax and inflation are among the reasons many say the Highway Trust Fund could soon run out of money.
The Highway Trust Fund is going to become insolvent by 2021 is what data suggests. Congress will have to act, as the way that the law is written right now, it simply is going to run out of money.
Several groups have called for an increase in the federal gas tax, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which usually opposes almost all tax increases.
It's very difficult to raise a tax around here. Nobody really likes that word. You see states raising the gas tax, and then when the federal government wants to try to come in and raise a gas tax, you know, a lot of counties, a lot of folks just don't understand the differentiation between the two, and it just seems like they're being taxed all the time.
So what happens if a funding solution for the Highway Trust Fund isn't found?
There will be less maintenance on our roads. There will be less preservation of the roads. There will be fewer jobs in the private sector. You will see construction companies lay people off because they won't have money to pay for folks, because there won't be money to pay for folks to do the work. And it will be a major contributor to job loss in the United States. It will decrease our competitiveness as our roads begin to crumble and it takes longer to get from point A to point B, whether you're a personal driver or a truck driver delivering goods. There's nothing good economically, that is for the economy, to the Highway Trust Fund running dry. Nothing good comes from that.
In addition to the Environment and Public Works, 3 other U.S. Senate committees and 2 U.S. House committees also have jurisdiction over surface transportation issues. It's unclear when those committees will introduce their reauthorization legislation. That will likely lead to a conference committee where the differences in the 2 bills will be worked out. Jennifer?
Thanks, Tammy. When we come back, we talk with Washington State's Secretary of Transportation, Roger Millar. We'll hear his thoughts on road projects like the one behind me and the challenges his department faces. Coming up. Welcome back to Washington. The state's Department of Transportation oversees all kinds of modes of transportation within the state. This includes more than 18,000 miles of state highways, nearly 3,300 bridges, the largest ferry system in the nation, and railways. We spoke with Washington State Secretary of Transportation Roger Millar about the challenges faced by his department, funding shortfalls, and what should be included in future transportation plans. From highways to bridges to ferries to railways, across mountains and waterways, Washington State's unique landscape for moving commerce and people is both a great asset and a logistical challenge.
We move a lot of people. We also move a lot of goods and a lot of services, and just the geographic constraints in the Central Puget Sound, everything goes through this hourglass, this funnel, And it makes for interesting times.
Secretary Millar says transportation is vitally important for our economy.
Everybody thinks it's just little Seattle, it's just little Washington. No, we are big in the world market. If you think about it, 2 of the 3 trillion-dollar entities are headquartered in the Puget Sound with Amazon and Microsoft. And the third, Apple, has a big presence here as well.
With that growing economy comes growing pains.
And population and employment, that's a good problem to have. A lot of people would love to have Washington State's problems. That said, they are problems.
Millar says in the past, the solution to dealing with congested highways was to add another lane.
They continue to do that in some parts of the country and some parts of the world, but we've come to a realization that the way you address congestion is not adding capacity.
He says traffic congestion is more a symptom of another problem.
The problem is that we don't have affordable housing choices and transportation options for the people that we serve. But if you have to live on the fringe of the community because you can't afford to live in the core, when you're out there on that fringe, your only option is to drive. You're not going to bike to work 40 miles. You're not going to walk. Uber, that's not reasonable. It's incredibly expensive and inefficient to provide bus service. So you get in your car and drive. And so a lot of the cars that are on our highway are working poor who can't afford to live where they'd rather live, closer to their job.
Between Marysville and Tumwater, the Department of Transportation responds to about 60 incidents on any given day, and half of them are mechanical breakdowns.
An awful lot of it is cars that shouldn't be on the road in the first place, but the owners have no choice.
This is our Transportation Management Center. So this is like the brains of the highway system.
As more cars fill highways, employees at DOT's Traffic Management Center in Shoreline watch roadways for accidents and congestion.
The highway system is kind of on the breaking point all the time. If there is an incident, we need to quickly get to the scene and we need to clear it and move it off of the roadway so we can free things back up again.
The triaging that happens on state highways is another reason for alternative kinds of transportation. That may mean light rail for Tacoma, but something else to connect eastern Washington communities from outlying areas.
One size doesn't fit all, and that something that works in the International District may not work in Yakima, and something that works in the Okanagan may not be the appropriate solution in Spokane. So we have to craft our programs and our projects for the places we work.
Secretary Millar says connecting issues like land use to transportation is vital for future planning.
For the longest time, in the transportation world, we were taught that you're not in the land use business. You're not a decider in land use. It's not your business. It is so much our business because the investments we make have tremendous consequences in terms of where development goes. And the development that's approved has tremendous consequences on our system.
Millar believes maintaining the roadways and ferry systems that are already in place should be a key priority.
We go to the legislature and say, we don't have the money to maintain the facilities we have. And the legislative response is, here's some money to build some more things that you don't have the money to operate and maintain.
He says the impact on lack of revenue for maintenance is felt in a number of ways.
Lowering the speed limit because the pavement's too rough to go 70 miles an hour or 60 miles an hour. Tying up ferry boats because they can't be safely operated. Turning off the lights at facilities because we don't want to have catastrophic failures. Actually taking pieces of the system out of operation for safety's sake. That's not a good place to be. That's just not a good place to be.
What's the solution then for a new stream of funding? What can we do?
The gas tax is the devil we know. People don't like the gas tax, but they're used to it, and it's it gradually raising the temperature. Every time there's a raise in the gas tax, there's a big kerfuffle, and then everybody gets used to it, and you do it again. The tools in the toolbox are tolling, congestion pricing, road user charges. Or you can also do sales tax, you can do property tax, Which one do you like? You know, it's going to be a real hard debate.
It's a debate that Millar says needs to be given full attention by state lawmakers, since the federal government plays an increasingly smaller role in funding.
When we built I-5, 90 cents of every dollar invested in I-5 came from the federal government. Today, 20 cents of every dollar we spend comes from the federal government. And the number's going down.
Millar says with the lack of federal funding for states for maintenance and new projects, it's clear states are shouldering more of the costs. But there is another funding stream the federal government is supporting. Tammy, what can you tell us about this?
Jennifer, with the uncertain future of infrastructure funding, the need for alternative funding sources continues to grow.
The way it works is, you know, there's public money, there's private money, just inherently what it's called, the P3s, and they both come together to invest in a project that is good for the public in general.
One alternative financing source is public-private partnerships, or P3s. In transportation, P3s are an agreement between a private company and a state or local government who own most transportation infrastructure.
Counties own a very significant amount of the nation's infrastructure. They own 45% of public roads, almost 40% of the national bridge inventory.
Despite not being directly involved in P3s, the federal government still plays a role in the process through its transportation programs, funding, and regulatory oversight. During an event in June, Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao advocated for public-private partnerships as an option for states.
We're talking basically about, how to fund that large number, be it $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion. And there is the left, the Democrats, who by and large want this funded fully by federal spending. But there are other ways to finance our public infrastructure. Right. And that is through allowing the private sector to come in, leverage private sector, local and state government resources so that it's a partnership. And then the leveraging effect can actually help the federal government, our country, to reach that larger number. Yeah. So if it's $2 trillion, let's go back to the president's original proposal, which is $1 trillion, and then it was $1.5 trillion. You can allow the private sector to come in and fill the gap. Right. And there could be a federal share, there can be a state and local share, so it doesn't have to be 100% federal funding.
But there are concerns about public-private partnerships, including access.
P3s are not applicable everywhere. A lot of our counties can't utilize private investment because they simply can't attract it.
Despite concerns about the feasibility of public-private partnerships, it's something the federal and state governments are looking at to help fill the transportation funding gap. Jennifer?
Thanks, Tammy. When we return from Washington State, data. It seems like we have a lot of it these days.
35 years ago, you were desperately looking for data, any data. Please, dear God, give me a data point. And now it's, oh my God, what am I going to do with all of this data?
But how is data being used to learn about transportation policies and the impact on communities? That and more coming up. Welcome back. As lawmakers and transportation officials work toward figuring out how to fund transportation into the future, the director of the Washington State Transportation Center at the University of Washington is hoping data will play a role in those decisions. We sat down with Mark Hallenbeck recently, and he showed us how information on people's commute could help drive policy decisions.
This is actually the easy math.
Yes. It's a summer weekday at the University of Washington's East Science Institute, and these young people are busy filling up whiteboards with algorithms that could one day make your daily commute a lot less stressful, but potentially more expensive.
They're interested in the equity side of who's using this system.
The students were picked from graduate programs around the country and are spending 10 weeks at the UW working with stakeholders and researchers using data to solve problems in the real world. These data science fellows are studying census data to determine who might be impacted if the city of Seattle decides to implement congestion pricing, a practice that would charge drivers during rush hour in urban areas.
What they're trying to do here is actually figure out what the income values are that are assigned to who you see making particular trips.
The data is real, and the equations could provide insight for a city struggling with what to do about its growing congestion that is slowing drivers and creating headaches for residents.
The real question behind congestion pricing is, what are you doing with the money that comes from it? And then there's the social equity side of, are you creating huge disadvantages for particular groups of the population? And if so, what are you doing about those problems that you are actually creating for people?
Those people who have to go in at a certain time.
That's right.
Hallenbeck has spent decades working with public agencies on transportation issues. He has seen the needs of communities change as the land around them changes.
The land use we build defines which modes work. When a land is built out, the car does not work. In a rural environment, the car is the absolute winner. In an urban environment like Manhattan, it does not work. Our problem is we're transitioning from rural to something closer to Manhattan, right? And that's a painful process.
While Seattle is growing, Eastern Washington faces other transportation dilemmas.
Moses Lake doesn't have our congestion problems. They have different kinds of problems. They have, how are we going to repair this road? We've spent the last 100 years building new infrastructure, and unfortunately any mechanical thing, and a road and a bridge are mechanical things, they wear out.
In both Eastern and Western Washington, funding for maintenance tends to lag behind.
You don't get elected saying, I'm going to repair this bridge. You get elected by saying, I'm going to build you a new, cool bridge. But then 20 years from now, it's time to repair or replace that bridge. And repairing and replacing things is actually more expensive than building the original one.
Hallenbeck says a tax or fee applied statewide could be a hard sell to residents.
It's really tough to say to the people in Spokane, you should pay more gas tax so that I can widen I-5 in Thurston County.
He says a user fee for only roads traveled may be the ticket.
It doesn't matter where you come from. If you use my road, you pay for it, right? That's a really good thing. You don't want to use my road? Fine, don't use my road. Don't pay for it.
The issue of how much to pay takes us back to the whiteboard and the data science students.
Transportation is an economic good. When you raise the cost, people use it less. When you lower the cost, people use it more.
To understand this idea more,
the joke I tell my students is, how many of you are going to Mexico for spring break? And in a class of 40, maybe you get one. And you say, well, okay, how many of you would go to Mexico if I could get you round trip airfare for two for $10? And the whole class says, except maybe one or two who have, family commitments, right? So everybody goes and say, well, look how much travel I just generated by reducing the cost of going to Mexico. Everybody is suddenly going to Mexico.
Paying more for the roads we use may ultimately be a way to create more reliable funding in some areas, but residents may need convincing.
Our problem with roads is we view them as being free, and so we don't use them as an economic beast. We don't think of them in that way, and therefore we overuse them relative to what we're willing to pay.
We also spoke with Hallenbeck about the future of transportation and what that might look like. We'll share his thoughts on our next episode of Washington to Washington. Tammy?
Thanks, Jennifer. Talk of infrastructure and transportation usually leads to discussions about roads and bridges, but a recently proposed federal bill would instead focus on safer streets.
Pedestrian fatalities have increased dramatically over the last decade. In fact, we've killed over 50,000 people who have been walking on streets in America in the last decade. That's an increase of almost 36%.
That breaks down to about 13 people per day being killed while walking in the U.S. Emiko Atherton with Smart Growth America says lack of foot-friendly infrastructure is one of the reasons for the increase.
We have cities and nonprofits and even private companies encouraging people to walk more, be more outside, walking to work, getting physically active, that 20 minutes a day. Unfortunately, our infrastructure isn't keeping up with that. So while we're encouraging people to walk more, we're not providing them the safe sidewalks, the crosswalks, the signal lights, the things that people need to be safe while they're walking on streets in the United States.
Atherton also cites what's called the suburbanization of poverty as a reason for the increase.
As prices in cities continue to go up, housing becomes very unaffordable for many people, and it forces them to move outside central cores that were built more for walking. And they're placed in suburbs or areas that were never designed with really people on foot or on bike or in wheels on mind.
But a new federal bill hopes to help reduce the number of pedestrian deaths. Introduced in both the House and Senate, the Complete Streets Act would require states to redesign streets to give all users equal access. 5% of states' federal highway funds would be used to pay for Complete Streets programs.
One of the biggest challenges we have right now in creating better bicycle and pedestrian safety is really changing the infrastructure that prioritizes the high-speed movement of vehicles. We tend to think of this as the status quo right now in the country, that really to get people to places faster in more convenient ways, it has to be done through the vehicle. And so when we do things for cyclists or people on foot or people in wheelchairs or now on scooters, maybe hoverboards are coming next, we continue to think of that as an enhancement or as an add-on instead of the integral part of the system.
But Atherton says funding is only one part of the equation.
It's not just thinking about, did I build a really nice sidewalk or bike lane on this one street, but does it connect up with the larger system? Is this actually providing true access? And we're seeing that in communities, again, throughout Washington State. I know we talk a lot about Seattle when we talk about Washington, but we're seeing that in all four corners of the state. And what's really exciting is last year the Kalispel tribe in Washington was the first tribal nation to adopt a Complete Streets policy.
Atherton says Washington State is a model for those looking to integrate the Complete Streets program. More than 100 communities across the state have already adopted Complete Streets policies. There is some opposition to the bill from other states. The California Department of Finance recently wrote a letter opposing it, saying it would cost too much for states to implement. Jennifer?
Tammy, officials here in Washington State acknowledge that this is a complicated issue with a large number of agencies and organizations that have a stake in how things turn out.
There's lots of ways to slice it and dice it, but it's a city issue, it's a county issue, it's a port issue, it's a transit agency issue. The state DOT's involved. We've got metropolitan planning organizations, regional transportation planning organizations. The private sector is a huge player, and the federal government.
Those organizations will be looking to the public to guide and support transportation plans now and into the future.
The future is the focus of our next Washington to Washington episode. We'll look at technology and infrastructure.
And Tammy, I'm looking forward to this episode. It was fun to get a window into how things may look. Here's a sneak peek of my conversation with Mark Hallenbeck on the future of cars.
You think traffic is bad outside an elementary school now? Just imagine when your automated car can drive you to work and will come back, take the one kid to elementary school, come back, take the next kid to the junior high, come back, next to there, right?
Thank you for joining us for Washington to Washington. We look forward to continuing our focus on the critical issues in this state.
And talking with people in both places who are working towards solutions. We welcome your feedback on this episode as well as your ideas for future episodes of Washington to Washington.
Connect with us on social media at WA2WA and share your thoughts.
For now, from Washington, D.C., thank you for watching.
And from Washington State, we hope you'll join us next time on Washington to Washington.